4:30 and had a number of planes that were delayed, and finally I got switched to a different airline and just landed about 45 minutes ago. So it's a good thing that we're all family here, and you will hopefully excuse my casual look here this evening. Thank you, Erica, for that wonderful introduction, and I'd like to thank Robert Green for putting all of this together, inviting me to be here over the next day. I'd like to thank Missouri History Museum and for all of you for being here this evening. And thank you. And as I was introduced, I think I heard in that introduction, did someone say I'm the great-grandson of Frederick Douglass? That's three greats.
Yes.
And the great-great-grandson of the great educator Booker T. Washington.
Yes.
Man, that's a whole lot of greats.
Yeah, it is.
And every time I tell people what my relationship is to my ancestors, not only is it a mouthful trying to say all of those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel very far removed. And you may be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection is to Douglass and Washington. It's like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with all of those zeros. But many people know a grandparent, and some of you may have even known a great-grandparent. And that's how close I feel to both of my ancestors. Because you see, my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 103 years old. She met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl. She didn't know that she was going to grow up and marry his grandson, but that's what happened. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, lived to be 95. And she was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And several years ago, I was with a group of 6th graders, and they were all looking at me almost cross-eyed, like, man, you are so far removed, and what does all of this ancient history have to do with my life today? And so I was trying to come up with a way to get them to understand how close I am in the generations, and I had this thought that hands that actually touched the great Frederick Douglass, and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington, also touched mine. So in a sense, even with all of those greats, I could say I stand just one person away from history. I stand one person away from each man, and I stand one person away from slavery. And when you consider the generations of families, we're not that far removed from the history of slavery. And I've had the honor and privilege over the past 11 years that we've been doing work with the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives and interacting and engaging with tens of thousands of young people around the country to really talk to them about this history, because our young people, it's been my experience, they don't know where they come from. But it's not their fault. I understand after coming out of hundreds of years of oppression and slavery and the trauma and how there was no plan for emancipation. We had 4 million enslaved people of African descent that were just set free with no plan. There was no counseling. There was no post-traumatic stress disorder syndrome designation. They had been separated from their families. They spent the first couple of years just looking, trying to reconnect with their families. Most did not know how to read and write because, as we know, it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write. So I understand, after coming out of all of that trauma, why these stories were not passed down. And so what we hope to do with our organization, what I hope to do tonight, is really talk about this history, and I hope that it's going to come alive for you. Because I'm going to tell you about 2 men that were born into slavery. They were born into the most horrific conditions that a human being could be subjected to, but yet through the power of education, and you heard it tonight in that brilliant spoken word by Gregory and the beautiful music. Let's give everybody a hand for the music and the spoken word. Both of my ancestors understood from a very young age that education would be their pathway to freedom, and they would have to steal their education. Now later in life, when people saw Frederick Douglass and they saw this white-haired statesman who was the first African-American nominated for Vice President of the United States, first African-American U.S. Marshal, first African-American Court of Deeds in the District of Columbia, first African-American ambassador and Consul General to Haiti, first African-American to have a statue dedicated in his honor, and the list goes on and on and on. And people will say, Frederick, I need to know, where'd you go to school? Where did you get your education? And having never spent one day of his life in a classroom, he would respond on occasion by saying, my degree is written on my back.
My Lord, my Lord.
So I'm going to tell you about two men that were born into slavery, but in spite of that, through education, they were able to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles to rise up, to effect change, to effect positive change in the lives of millions of people. And they've really set the groundwork along with many other heroes and heroines. But before I jump into that, I just want to address a couple of things. I get a couple of questions, usually when people meet me for the first time, and one of them is, so you're related to Frederick Douglass and to Booker T. Washington? Well, what do you do? And they always follow that up with, and it better be good. So there's been a little bit of pressure trying to live up to the legacies of these two great American heroes. Then the other question that I get is, Douglass and Washington weren't related to each other. How is it you're related to both of them? Anybody wondering that?
No.
Okay, well here's how it happened. It happened on my mother's side of the family. My grandfather, Frederick Douglass III, my mother's father, his name was Frederick Douglass III. He was a surgeon, and he was Frederick Douglass's great-grandson. And my grandmother, my mother's mother, Nettie Hancock Washington, was Booker T. Washington's granddaughter. And my grandparents met in 1941 at Tuskegee Normal Schooling Institute, which is the school that Booker T. Washington founded in 1881. They happened to be on campus the same day, which was really kind of an interesting thing because my grandmother was born in Tuskegee, but she was living in California at the time. She was just home for summer vacation. And my grandfather, as I said, was a surgeon, and he'd been commissioned down there by the Veterans Administration during World War II. So they just happened to be on campus the same day. They were rushing across to get to the other side and literally bumped into each other. Didn't know that the other descended from an historic family. And they fell in love at first sight and wound up getting married just 3 months later.
Wow.
Yeah, wow is right. Now, as the father of two daughters, I don't recommend for any of you young people that are here that you get married after knowing somebody only 3 months. But I think that there was a plan in place to bring these two historic families together. So my mother, Nettie Washington Douglass, who lives in Atlanta, is the first person to unite the bloodlines of the families. My mother was an only child, so I had the honor and privilege and blessing to be the first male to carry the dual lineage. So that's how the families collided, as we like to say in our family. So Frederick Douglass, he was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He was born on the eastern shore of Maryland to an enslaved woman and to a white man, it was presumed that his master was his father. He never had a pair of pants or shoes until he was around 7 years old. He used to sleep head first in an old corn sack on cold winter nights with his feet hanging out on a muddy, damp floor because that was the only way he could try and keep himself warm. He only saw his mother a handful of times his whole life, and that's because she lived on a plantation that was 12 miles away. So in order for her to see her son, she would have to work in the fields picking cotton from sun up to sundown, from seed to can't see, and then she would walk 12 miles in the middle of the night and spend just a few precious moments with him. He was about a year old at the time, and she would stay with him until he would fall asleep, and then she would have to walk 12 miles back so she could be back on the plantation by the time the sun came up, because if she wasn't, she was most likely going to face a brutal beating. But he did have someone early in his life that showed him some love and nurturing, and that was his grandmother, Betsy. Her job on the plantation was to raise the master's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and to raise the enslaved children until they were old enough to really begin their life in manual labor. And on this plantation, that was around 5 or 6 years old. And you'll notice that when I talk about Frederick's age, I'll say 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, and that's because he didn't know how old he was. There were no birth certificates for enslaved people. And he actually would guess the year of his birth, and he pointed it close to 1817. But after he passed away, there was some information that was uncovered by historians and placed it closer to 1818. So this year, 2018, we celebrate his bicentennial. which I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. So I say 5 or 6 because, again, we don't really know how old he was, but at that age, his grandmother came to him and said, "Frederick, we're going to go on a long journey." And that journey was a 12-mile walk to the main plantation called White House. Now, can you imagine this little boy who didn't know who his father was, had only seen his mother a few times in his life, and now the only person that showed him some love is taking him on this journey. And of course, she's very nervous because she had done this many times before, but this was the first time she'd ever taken this journey with her own blood, with her own kin. So I imagine that he was nervous. He was probably clinging to her skirt. She was carrying him much of the way when his legs wouldn't carry himself. And then when they would finally make that last mile walk from the street up the driveway, that's how big the plantation was. The driveway alone is almost a mile. And they would get to the big house, and he would kind of run off just to check out his surroundings and to get some bread to eat. And when he turned back to look for his grandmother, she was gone. And so now he truly was an orphan. So you have this little boy who had no family, he had no home, and he had no country, because he certainly was not considered a citizen. He was not even considered a full human being. But yet, in spite of all of that, again, he was able to rise up to go on to affect change in the world around him. And so when we tell these stories to young people, we want them to look at these great heroes and heroines from history as living people that actually overcame obstacles and challenges, because it becomes a tangible example to them that no matter what they're facing in their lives, and no matter what you all are facing in your lives, we can see that if humans have done it, humans can do it. And so at the age of 8 or 9 years old, Frederick had what he wrote in his first autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, which was published in 1845. In that book, he wrote, "I was always so hungry as a slave child. I always had this pit of hunger in my stomach that would never go away. And when he was at 8, he had what he called divine providence in his favor happen. And that was he was chosen from among all of the children on the plantation to go to Baltimore to be the house servant for his master's brother. His name was Hugh All. Now the importance of this move was he was leaving an environment where he wasn't around people that could help him to learn to read and write, and he was going to the big city. He would be around free black children that knew how to read and write, and he would be around poor white children. But what happened most importantly when he got there was his slave mistress, Sophia All, had never had a slave before. And she was just a kind Christian lady that saw this little bright boy, and she began to teach young Frederick his ABCs. And all he needed was that little spark of light, of knowledge into his mental darkness. Again, this is another message that is as relevant today when we talk about mental bondage and trying to free your mind from mental slavery. And so she teaches him. But when his master finds out, you know what happened? He got angry. And he looked at his wife and he looked at young Frederick and he said, "You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave." Did you all hear that? I think I heard it in the spoken word too.
Amen.
His master said, "You cannot teach him how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave." And so Frederick looked at his master and he thought, if you don't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it.
Yes.
And he understood right then and there that knowledge is power, and education would be his pathway to freedom.
Yes.
And so he begins to teach himself to read and write. And he was very clever in the way that he was able to do that. Now, remember, he's in the big city, so he's able to interact with the children in the city. So he would pick up a stick off the ground and he would draw in the dirt, and he would say, "Susie, is this how you write an S?" Or he would scratch it on the wall, and she would say, "No, Freddie B, this is how you write an S." And he would file it away and take that information with him, and he would build on it. He would always carry in his pocket bread, and he would trade bread with the poor kids for reading lessons. A moment ago I said that he wrote in his autobiography, "I was always so hungry as a slave child that I always had this pit of hunger in my stomach that would never go away. And on occasion, when I would get food, the overseer would take cornmeal mush throw it into a pig's trough, and all of the children, including Frederick, would crawl on their hands and knees as fast as they could to eat what little food was in there. To eat like pigs. To eat like animals, because that's what he was considered. He was property. He was no better than the cattle, the sheep, the horses, the pigs. So now if we think about this idea of this little boy that would trade bread, he would trade food, something of such great importance and value to him for reading lessons. Again, what does that say about the power of knowledge and education? That he would rather, what, feed his mind and have his stomach go empty.
My Lord.
So what his master predicted happened as he started to grow, and he's breaking the chains of mental bondage. He's becoming unfit. His master said he would also be running away with himself if he had the knowledge. He became unfit and unruly. So he was sent to a slave breaker by the name of Edward Covey. And Covey's job was to break slaves, to break them to the level of a brute, to an animal. And Douglas was hired out to Covey for a year. And when he got there, Covey would whip him. And then he would start to whip him again. And then the beatings would become more frequent as he saw that he wasn't breaking Frederick. Also in that autobiography, he wrote, "The slavery was so brutal to me, the pen with which I'm putting these words down to paper, I could rest in the cracks and fissures of my feet that have never closed shut."
My Lord.
And as Covey would whip him, he'd whip him so bad the welts on his back wouldn't have a chance to heal. And after 6 months of taking these brutal beatings, Frederick said, "I was almost reduced to the level of a brute." But there was something inside of him, there was a spirit inside of him that rose up, and he decided to fight back. Now he and Covey had an epic 2-hour battle that was more of a wrestling match than fisticuffs, because Frederick was also smart enough to know that if I hurt him and I defeat him in that way, or I kill him, that's going to be my fate. So he was strategic enough to say, I'm going to just defeat him and break him down. And so they wrestled for 2 hours, and then finally, Covey gets up and he's on the ground, and he's breathing heavily. And Frederick looks at him, and he would later describe the moment as, "You have seen how a boy has been made a slave, now you see how a slave has been made a man." And that was the point of Frederick Douglass' self-liberation. His self-liberation told. Now I don't have a chance to go through the whole story, but I kind of jump forward a little bit, and I'll say in September 3rd, 1838, he would disguise himself as a sailor, and he would carry with him forged identification papers, and he would finally escape the chains that bound him. He would go by train, and then by boat, and then land in New York City. When he gets to New York City, he calls for Anna Murray Douglas, my great-great-great-grandmother, to come and get married. And I have to mention Anna because we are just as proud of her as we are of Frederick. And I would say that there would be no Frederick Douglass without Anna Murray Douglas. She was the first person in her family to be born free in Baltimore. And she and Frederick met when he was a young man, and as they're starting to get closer together, first as friends, and then start to think about maybe a future together, Anna was the first person to plant the seed of thought in his mind, you're not meant to be a slave. And as they're starting to fall in love, she said, Frederick, I don't want our children's father to be a slave. History is important for a lot of reasons. I like to think history is most important because we need to know where we've come from in order to know where we're going.
Yes.
And we're also making history tonight. We're making history today for what is going to reverberate beyond the walls of this hall. And the butterfly effect, and how the knowledge that you share with me and hopefully that I'm sharing with you will go beyond the walls of this room. And so think about it. Had Anna not planted that seed of thought in his mind, who knows if he ever would have had the courage to run away from slavery? Had she not sold her feather bed to help finance his escape, who knows if he would have ever had the courage to run away from slavery? Had she not helped to sew the disguise that he wore, who knows if he ever would have escaped successfully from slavery? And had that not happened, we would be a very different country than we are today had there been no Frederick Douglass as the great abolitionist. So the other thing that we always talk to kids about all the time is make the moment of every time, all the time you have, is because you're making history today. And so Anna joins him in New York. They get married. With the help of the Underground Railroad Network, they make their way to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he would change his name from Frederick Bailey. They would take on the last name Douglas, and they would begin their lives together. He had a skill as a ship caulker from his time working as a skilled laborer in Baltimore. So he gets a job when he gets to New Bedford. Now, I've often thought about this. If I was enslaved for 20 years, and I finally escaped, and I'm in a free state, though now, talking about the morality, the immorality of slavery versus equality, black people being equal to white people is a whole nother discussion and conversation. But being in a free place, being married, have a job, and then they start to have a family together, I probably would have just said, hey, I'm good. Let me just try and exist in this space. But thank goodness he and many others didn't. He looked at that institution of slavery, of legalized slavery, and he figured out, okay, how can we go about dismantling this institution? And so he would attend an anti-slavery meeting that was being held by William Lloyd Garrison, the white abolitionists, and the Garrisonians. And Garrison heard that he had this fugitive slave in the audience. And he asked Frederick, will you just get up, will you just tell the audience your story? Just tell them what it was like to be enslaved. And he wrote later that he said, this was my first time speaking in front of a white audience, and I was so nervous that my knees were knocking together and I was shaking from every limb. But what he did was he stood up, and he had a natural gift for communication. He was eloquent, he was charismatic, he was theatrical, he was funny in the way that he described his condition. It was the first time that the public was hearing from somebody that had suffered the brutality of slavery, that could tell it in a way that nobody else before him ever had. And so Garrison asked him, will you join us? Let's go from town to town, and you just tell your story, Frederick. And so he did that, but then he started to have a problem. And that problem was people started to doubt that he'd ever been enslaved. They said, look at him, look at the way he dresses. Look at the way he speaks. Look at his writings. There's no way that that man was ever a slave. Because what he's doing is he's shattering the notion in the public consciousness that people of African descent were not worthy of freedom, were not worthy of citizenship, that they were savages from a faraway land and they were better off in slavery. Listen to the happy songs that they sing. Make them an other so we can justify brutalizing, dehumanizing, and exploiting them. Sounds pretty familiar today to me. So he is now standing up and he's shattering that notion. And people cannot wrap their minds around what they thought a slave looked and sounded like and what they were seeing in Frederick Douglass. So they started to call him a fraud. So in order to prove that he was who he said he was, he writes that autobiography, The Narrative, again, which was published in 1845. In it, he named names and he named places. Well, now he had another problem. And that problem was it became a bestseller. That's the last thing that you want, is the notoriety of a best-selling book if you're trying to hide from your master, because it made him an instant celebrity and a household name. So at the suggestion of the Garrisonians, he went to Europe for a couple of years as a cooling off period. And while he was there speaking out against the abolition of slavery in the United States, his abolitionist friends pulled their money together and purchased his freedom from his master for $711, which was a discounted rate. A lot of money at that time. And then he was able to return to the United States a free man and really begin his work. He and Anna and their family would settle in Rochester, New York, where he would spend 25 years as publisher of the North Star newspaper, which was the leading abolitionist voice. It's where he's buried at Mount Hope Cemetery, and really Rochester became his adopted hometown, and it's where he did most of his important work. He would become an advisor to presidents, particularly Abraham Lincoln, and he, along with the other abolitionists, would agitate to push President Lincoln to a point where he would eventually sign the Emancipation Proclamation, which, as we know, only freed those who were enslaved in the states of rebellion. We would need the passing of the 13th Amendment to legally abolish slavery. So that's Frederick Douglass in kind of a nutshell. I want to spend a few moments talking about Booker T. Washington as well, because his blood flows through my veins too. He benefited from the work of Douglass and the abolitionists, and he was freed when that Emancipation Proclamation was signed. He wanted to go to school so badly